Okay, we're talking about mida keneged mida, which means something like measure for measure, or it means the way you behave is the way you're treated. And those who want to use this concept to interpret what happens to us, the things that are happening to me are a response to what I have done. I will look carefully enough at what I've done and what happens to me all the time or much of the time. I'll be able to figure out why it's happening. I'll be able to read the message in the event that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was sending me. And that, I told you at the beginning of the chapter, I think that that's a mistaken conclusion. I think we can very rarely, if ever, read it, so I have to deal with the idea of mida keneged mida. And I said that I had 3 reservations. I'll go through them briefly again, just to have them on the table. First of all, when you talk about mida keneged mida, in the definition of that concept, there are 2 categories of punishments which aren't included. And since they aren't included, that already introduces an ambiguity. When a person is suffering, maybe his suffering is one of those that isn't included. Some say that when it does apply, it only applies in the particular limb with which the transgression was performed, but not in the quality of what happens to the limb vis-a-vis the quality of what he did with the limb when he created the transgression, which means that the connection, when it works, is a very loose connection. And sometimes it picks out one characteristic of the crime and a characteristic of the punishment, which each has 10 possible characteristics, and there are many different linkages, and it does it on the basis of only one linkage. So it comes out that it's going to be very, very difficult to apply it in practice. So let's take a look at the actual sources where this appears. This is quite an interesting and somewhat complex study of the Talmudic sources, which should be worthwhile even in of itself. And I have the Hebrew here, but I'll just read the translation for that. Rava or Rav Chisda said, if a person sees suffering coming to him, he should check his actions. I put in, to see if an action of his is the reason that he's suffering. To see if, as you'll see now. So that's what he should do, check his actions. If he checked but did not find an action that could be the cause, he should attribute his suffering to a failure of Torah study. If he attributed his suffering to a failure of Torah study and found that this not to be the case, then necessarily the suffering is due to Hashem's love for him. Okay, man, this is a very, very difficult passage. It's very difficult. Before I do it on the next page where I go through it in detail, let's think about it. He should check his actions to see if one of his actions is the cause. If he checked but did not find, are we assuming that his checking is 100% effective? Are we allowing for the possibility that he checked and did not find, but there really is one that he didn't find? What are we assuming here? If he checked and did not find, do we conclude there wasn't one? Well, let's see. He said if he checked and did not find, he should attribute his suffering to a failure of Torah study, meaning that and nothing else. So that seems to assume his checking is perfect. Wasn't kashrus, wasn't lashon hara, wasn't Shabbos, wasn't davening. Frankly, I would be inclined to think maybe he missed it and it's there. No. The Gemara is not assuming that. That's number one. And number two, if it's a failure of Torah study, why isn't that a transgression? Isn't that a transgression? So he is attributing it to a transgression. But then what do you mean he attributes it? That means he searched, he didn't find. He didn't even find a failure of Torah learning. And now he attributes it to Torah learning even though he didn't find it. Well, why? If it's possible that he has a failure of Torah learning and he didn't find it when he checked, it's also possible that he had a failure of Shabbos and he didn't find it when he checked. The logic of the procedure here is not open at all. Furthermore, it says, if he attributed to a failure of Torah study and found this not to be the case, how did he do that? How did he find it not to be the case? Here, let's go through the steps again, right? He tries to find it in everything except Torah study. He doesn't find it, and we assume, apparently, that his checking is perfect. And no, I said it wrong. He's checking for transgressions and doesn't find them. So it doesn't find one, so we assume his checking is perfect. It isn't that he missed one in Shabbos or missed one in Kashrus or missed one someplace else. No. He done. So then he should go to another subject. What's another subject? Let's say a failure of Torah study. So, but he was checking everything before. He didn't leave Torah study out. That's also a mitzvah. It's also a ve'er if it's a failure of Torah study. So now we're assuming that he checked everything, didn't find anything, and he's going to attribute it to a failure of Torah study, which means his checking isn't perfect. But if his checking isn't perfect, then why were we confident that when he ruled out Shabbos and ruled out Kashrus and all the rest, that they're really ruled out? And then it says, if he attributed to Torah study, means attributing without finding, without identifying it. Just, okay, that Chazal are telling me it's got to be there, and then he discovered that was a mistake. How did he discover it was a mistake? Check again? But we're assuming his checking isn't perfect, for Torah study anyway. So this piece of Gemara, very short, sounds very simple, is full of difficulty. Perhaps it's quite difficult to understand. Here are some of the questions raised by the commentators. In the first stage, he checks his actions. Does that not include his Torah study? If it does, and he finds no fault in his Torah study, how can he attribute the suffering to a fault in his Torah study? At the bottom here, I give you the commentators who say these things in Hebrew. To attribute the suffering to a failure of Torah study means that he does not himself see the connection. He's been following the rule of this dictum, this rule in the Gemara. What then does it mean that he finds that the attribution is incorrect? And then the third is, if the third position is that it's God's love for him, why would Hashem's love for him dictate that he must suffer if he has done nothing wrong to deserve it? Rashi's explanation, this is where Yisur B'Shal Va'ava comes from. It's the sufferings of love. Rashi's explanation, and these are the words that he says. It could be interpreted in various ways, but the words that he says are, God visits suffering upon him in this world to increase his reward in the world to come. Many put it, I say, graphically in the following way: why shouldn't he eat from both tables? Why should his receiving the bigger reward in the world to come require that he suffer here? If he's done nothing wrong to deserve punishment, then why shouldn't he just simply enjoy both worlds? This we saw already in the Rambam. The Rambam rejects this idea altogether because it's unjust. And although you could interpret Rashi otherwise, like other commentators say, of course the Rambam didn't see Rashi, but since it's in Rashi, and the Rambam says some of our sages have interpreted it this way, so that's why he rejects it. There are other ways to interpret the statement in the Gemara, but there's even another way to interpret Rashi, and that is to say, Kodesh Baruch Hu brings suffering on him, and it's a test to see whether he will maintain his trust in HaKadosh Baruch Hu and his belief in HaKadosh Baruch Hu and maintain the level in which he does his mitzvot. In other words, he's giving him a test, not just suffering for pleasure, but he's giving him a test to see if he'll pass the test. Right? Now, the Rambam himself doesn't agree with that concept of test, but it's not just a trade-off, pain here and more pleasure there. It's a test of your consistency and commitment, and if you pass that test, you deserve a bigger reward. That wouldn't be obviously unjust because we talked about tests vis-a-vis the Rambam, Okay, but Rambam doesn't believe in a test like that. Because as he said, the test is only to show people what to do and what to believe, not just to increase somebody's reward in the world to come. But it's a subject that needs to be addressed by whoever is going to interpret the passage for us. Yeah.
In chapter 26 of Tanya, it talks about the kind of any suffering coming from a deeper, closer part of Hashem, his four-letter name. Is this similar in terms of why it's happening, or more in the Tanya is really talking about more of the reaction to it?
Look, the Ramchal in part 2, chapters 2 and 3 of the Derech Hashem gives about 8 reasons why people suffer. And to match them up with what other people say is a very difficult thing. In particular, someone who represents Kabbalah has I would say, categorically different look at the idea of suffering. The Rambam we're learning the Rambam here, and he starts with the principle of justice. Right? We spoke about trials, we talk about the suffering of the tzaddikim, but his basic principle is justice. From the point of view of Kabbalah, justice is not the only principle. There are principles of suffering that have absolutely nothing to do with justice. They're completely divorced from justice. The question of justice doesn't arise in this context. It's just a non-question. In particular, the perfection of the world is a project divided up among humanity, and perfection means facing certain challenges and overcoming them. And it could be, for example, that a person's tikkun, as we speak about, in the world is to face the challenge of poverty. His whole life, that's his tikkun, poverty. That's all. That's what he's here for. He's here to face the challenge of poverty. That's his position in the world. He will never have money. Never. He can be the biggest tzaddik in the world. He's not suffering because he's being punished. That's his tikkun. That's his project. His project is to work on poverty. The question of justice doesn't arise. There's a major principle of why people suffer that has nothing to do with justice whatsoever. Nothing to do with their past actions whatsoever. So we're talking with worlds away from where the Rambam is coming from. And of course, the Tanya is a sefer based on Kabbalah. So, okay. So, here is one answer to each question. So the question was, when he made his first investigation, does that include Torah study or not? And if it does, and he doesn't find any fault, how can he attribute the suffering to his fault in Torah study? Finding no fault does not mean there is no fault. We cannot assume that our search is 100% effective and accurate. It may be that we have forgotten what we have done. That's one possibility. And more subtle and more important, it may be that we remember, but we wrongly interpret and evaluate what we've done. I thought I was doing right, not wrong. So how will I be able to attribute my suffering to that failure when I don't think it's a failure? I'm going to investigate. The Gemara says I should investigate. Well, that means not only with my memory, but with my interpretation and understanding of what happened. And if I'm making a mistake, and people do make mistakes like that, don't they? They think what they did was right, and it turns out that it was wrong. Okay, now, that means a person's capable of making a mistake across the board. So now we have to fill in more as to see why Torah study is separated out. Torah study is an area with many subtle conditions for correct action. It is reasonable to attribute the suffering to an action in the area of Torah study, which he did not and still does not understand is wrong. In other words, yes, people make mistakes. Nobody's self-evaluation is perfect. But where is he more likely to go wrong? Now, in particular, there are rules as to when it is appropriate to stop studying Torah in order to do something else. And here, in particular, I'm talking about stopping studying Torah. There's a big difference in the study of Torah whether you fail to start to study Torah versus stopping studying Torah. I don't mean stopping for years. I'm stopping for the afternoon. Right? Stopping is much more serious because you're cutting it short, whereas not starting is not as serious. So now, if there's a mitzvah that has to be done and nobody else can do it, or maybe nobody else will do it, or maybe nobody else will do it as well as I will do it. Exactly when does it permit not studying Torah? And you have to work to earn a living. How much of a living? Gives you permission to work rather than study Torah? And at what age? And what kind of Torah study? The Gemara has rules for how you should study Torah. Very, very few educational institutions in our world follow those rules, because there are needs that have to be met and crises that have to be faced, and many have taken the position that, although those are the rules of the Gemara, we can't follow them today, we have to do something different. Okay, something different, how different, when different, to what extent, when should you go back? There are disagreements about that today. So a time of Torah study where you might be not doing what the Torah really requires in terms of Torah study, that's something which is very subtle and very complex and very detailed. So according to this answer, here's an area where you're much more likely to make a mistake in your evaluation of your failures than other areas. So the progress in the Gemara will be like this. First of all, make an overall evaluation. You didn't find any failures. This stage assumes that there is a failure. There is a failure. You just didn't find it. So now, what should I do? Well, considering that it's much harder to investigate Talmud Torah than it is to investigate anything else, we said the probability is the mistake was in the investigation of Talmud Torah, and it's really a failure of Talmud Torah. Right? Obviously, it's not going to be a failure that he sees, he understands, and he says, aha, my car had a flat tire, and that's because I didn't drive to the shear, and because if he saw that, he would have found it. So here, Midah K'neged Midah is not going to help him to find it. It's just attributing it to Talmud Torah, because most likely that's where he's missing it. Okay, that's step one. Now, so then it says, you attributed the Torah and you find out that it was a mistake. Really? How did you find out it was a mistake? Well, here's a suggestion that some say. The attribution of suffering to an unknown Torah, failure of Torah study, can be tested by taking extreme care in the future to check every possible doubt in this area. If consistent, perfect performance of Torah study does not alleviate the suffering, he can conclude the attribution is mistaken. You don't have to conclude the attribution was mistaken by discovering the mistake and discovering where it was that you failed. There's another way. The other way is to perfect your performance now and see if the problem goes away. The whole point of the investigation was to find the cause of the suffering so that, like the Ramban said about the time of prophecy and all the rest, so that you could correct the failure and that way stop the suffering. You might be able to correct the suffering without discovering what the cause was. How? By eliminating every possible cause. If you eliminate every possible cause and the suffering persists, then you know that the attribution to Talmud Torah wasn't correct. So that being the case, we have a way to discover that the attribution to Talmud Torah was a mistake without yet discovering what the problem was. Are you with me so far? I mean, it just shows you that a very simple passage in the Gemara can be very complex, very subtle, and require a lot of work to make clear. Now I see that I should have printed another page. Actually, I have this. Oh, by the time I find it out. What's the third thing? The third thing is, why must he suffer if he's done nothing wrong to deserve it? So this idea of Yisurim Shel Ahava is a widely discussed idea. As I told you, the Rambam says, some interpret it as more pain and suffering here so as to get more reward there, and the Rambam rejects that b'shtei yadayim. That's simply not possible. That's just utter injustice. the Ramban agrees to reject that interpretation of the idea. But he gives it a different interpretation. He doesn't reject the statement in the Talmud, he gives it a different interpretation. By the way, when I say that the Rambam rejects the statement of the Talmud, you have to be very careful about that. That sounds very bold and it sounds almost heretical. But it's not true, because there are disagreements in the Talmud. We don't follow every statement in the Talmud. Many statements are made in the name of Beis Shammai. We don't follow those at all, except for the Yud Ches Dover, which was one. But all the rest of them, we don't follow them at all. The genuine Talmudic statements, we don't follow them. So sometimes you have what's called machlokes haSugyos. The Gemara will treat a subject in various places in different ways and come to different conclusions. And if it's a question of practical halacha, you have to paskin which way to go. And that means this Talmudic statement we don't follow, because we follow that one, and that one tells us differently. That's like with the 6,000 years. Right? The Rambam rejects the idea that at the end of 6,000 years the world will come to an end. First of all, because he says the statement itself contradicts that conclusion, because it says the 7,000 it's choruv, and 7,000, 1,000 years the world came to an end. There wouldn't be time, so you couldn't have it 7,000. Number one, says the Rambam. Second of all, he says it's a statement of a particular scholar, but we have many verses and many Talmudic statements which contradict it. And so if he really meant what he said, it's rejected by the majority of statements in the Talmud. So when the Rambam says, he quoted 25 psukim that God operates with justice, and he quoted many statements in the Gemara that God operates with justice. Here's one interpretation of one statement in the Talmud which says God doesn't operate with justice. He says, I'm sorry. It's a minority statement, and we don't follow it. We don't agree with it. The Ramban says that the suffering of love is in fact punishment for a transgression. It is punishment for a transgression. But, he says, a transgression is done b'shogeg. Now, that fits pretty well into the pshat we were saying in the Gemara, because we are questioning what his investigation revealed to him and how much he can rely upon its investigation. And the pshat we are saying now is, you don't rely on your investigation 100%. We know that people make mistakes. Shogeg is a very, very likely place for him to not find it by investigation. Shogeg means that at the time that he did it, he didn't realize that it was wrong. Who says he'll realize later that he did it, that it was wrong? He's guilty because he didn't investigate adequately. He had a responsibility to investigate, and he didn't investigate. But very often, the reason a person doesn't investigate is because he doesn't realize he has to investigate. He hasn't checked that. So he's totally oblivious to what the facts are. So Ramban says that this is Yisur Shel Ahava because a person cannot get into the world to come with the remainder of transgression on him. It has to be cleansed. And he says, this is in the Shar Hagbul, and he doesn't explain it there, and I don't know any place else where he explains it. Not that I've read all the Rambans, and if somebody knows, I'll be very happy to hear it. He says, Shogeg does not belong to be removed in Gehenna. It's not the kind of thing that Gehenna is supposed to be used to wipe away. That being the case, it's this world or nothing. If nothing can happen in this world to cleanse him of the consequences of Shogeg, he's not going to make it into the world to come. He can't get into the world to come. That's a world in which is all good. There can't be any evil in it. So out of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's love for him, wanting to get him into the world to come, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives him the suffering of this world to take away those blemishes. That's perfectly just. Not only just, but it's also kind. So there, if the Rambam had considered that interpretation of the statement in the Gemara, he wouldn't have had any problem with it. Wouldn't have had any problem with it at all. Yeah.
I wanted to ask a bit more in this concept because when we see Yosef in jail, that he asked twice to the person that was in there to remind Pharaoh about him, right? And that cost him 2 extra years, right, in prison.
Yes.
So how do we he?
That's very interesting. How do we interpret the fact that he used two words? Schartani, Schartani. You should remember me and you should mention me to Pharaoh. And he said that it cost him extra 2 years in jail. There is a midrash, a fascinating midrash. I think the pasuk goes, Ashri hagever asher batach b'Hashem v'lo pana el rahavim. Happy is the person who trusted in Hashem and didn't turn to the princes. So the midrash comes as follows: happy is the person who trusts in Hashem, that's Yosef, and who didn't turn to the princes, that's Yosef. Meaning he did turn to the princes, and that's bad. So the midrash takes this verse and says, happy is the person who trusts in Hashem, that's Yosef, who does trust in Hashem and is happy, and doesn't turn to the princes, like Joseph turned to the princes badly. So the very same sentence is taken as praising him and criticizing him. And Rav Dessler, among others, I think basically the Torah says the same thing, says that's exactly the message. The message is taking action to improve your situation depends upon your level of trust. And the higher your level of trust, the less appropriate it is in many circumstances, there are other circumstances, but in many circumstances, to take proactive action to manage your circumstances on your own. Now, Joseph was on a very high level of trust in God. That's Asher Yiftach B'Hashem. He's happy, successful, because he trusts in Hashem. But he was on such a high level of trust in Hashem, he shouldn't have taken these actions to promote his freedom. And because he was on such a high level, that's why his taking this action is considered a failure. So the very same verse, according to the Midrash, both praises him and criticizes him. But the critique is based on the basis of the praise. Because he's on such a high level of trust in Hashem, that's why he failed in taking these actions to promote his freedom. Now, Rav Dessler says that calculating what your real level of trust is and determining what types of measures you should take to promote your circumstances is very, very difficult. It's very difficult. And great, great people have failed. We just read about one this Shabbos, yesterday. Who was that great, great person who failed?
Yeshua.
Moses! Because he agreed to send the spies. And it was a mistake. He shouldn't have done it.
Should have said women.
They would have passed it.
He shouldn't have done it. So, you have to read the Mablum there. It's a long, complicated story. So he says, if Moses could make a mistake, that means anyone could make a mistake. So that teaches you, number one, you should be afraid of that. Of course, Moses' mistake is on his level, and our mistake is on our level, but it's something which is given to mistake. And second of all, you should pray to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He should help you make the right decision. You should recognize the fact that you are capable of making a mistake. Yeah.
Ramban's solution sounds like it might be sufficient to solve this problem, but he introduced the principle a while back that our souls that we have now were in the Garden of Eden and perhaps at other points like at Har Sinai, and they might have made mistakes at those points and made errors then. Couldn't it be that if we in our current lives are living, immaculately, that we essentially are then able to make headway towards the sin that we made in past states of our soul, and thereby, and maybe that's like an act of love, that we're allowed to work against the principle which we come into our life with, that's more like communal among the people.
Okay, well, you're saying a lot of things, and I don't mind. But we have to take them apart. First of all, let me just clarify the vocabulary. When the rabbinic sources say that our souls were present at Sinai, it does not mean incarnation. It means the souls were there as souls. But then if they were there as souls, no question they're doing something wrong. A soul can't do anything. Only a soul together with a body can do something. No free will if you don't have a soul and a body. That's why you have a soul and a body. You have a soul and a body so that you can exercise free will. So it's not a question of doing something wrong there. Well, what I guess you mean is previous incarnations. There's no question that our sources that do accept incarnation, not all sources do, but given our conditions today and scholarship today, the vast majority of sources do accept the idea of Gilgul Neshamos. Then for sure the suffering today could be a result of transgressions committed in a prior time. But that wouldn't be sufferings of love. That would be sufferings generated by crimes. That would be justice. The Rambam, if he believed in Gilgul, I'm not sure, I'm convinced that he didn't, but if he believed in Gilgul, would say, sure, there was a crime. It took place 500 years ago. What do I care how long ago it was? He was Mechal Shabbos, so he violated Shabbos, so that's why he's being punished here. That wouldn't be a problem. That wouldn't apply to sufferings of love, which, according to this statement in the Gemara, isn't coming from a transgression at all. That's the way Rashi takes it, and the Ramban says it is coming. Once it is coming, then it's a question of justice. Maybe no. Wait a second. In answering you, maybe I'm confusing things. Yeah, you're using the Ramban, so that means the sufferings of love are justice. They're a different kind of justice. Justice is something which can't be handled otherwise, right? So then, yes, I think that Gilgul would agree with what the Ramban is saying. A different. What do I care whether it's in this life, but it's a shogeg and you didn't understand it, versus it's in a past life which you don't remember.
I didn't combine them that way. That's nice.
Oh, okay, okay. I'm doing a little more than you're doing. I don't mind. Yeah.
So Rabbi, if we're getting punished for sins from our past life, how does Mida Kaniga connect, and then how do we do teshuva, like find the source of those sins? If we can't even remember them, how do we nullify the suffering?
So it's, okay. Oh, that's okay. Let's see how it's going to work here. By the way, the words Mida K'neged Mida don't appear in this passage in the Gemara. It's just that this passage of the Gemara assumes when you do your investigation that you're doing it to find the right cause for the suffering. And what principle do you use? You use the principle of Mida K'neged Mida. We'll have other places where the Gemara actually discusses these words. So one way is the way that I explained in stage 3. Let's go back to stage 3. I checked everything, all of my record, didn't find anything. Then I say, well, okay, my checking isn't perfect. Where am I most likely to make a mistake? In Talmud Torah. So I'll attribute it to Talmud Torah, even though I haven't found anything in particular, but I'll attribute it to Talmud Torah. Fine. Then it says, he found that attribution was wrong. And we asked, well, how did he do that? If he didn't find the one that was meant, and he thinks it's hiding there someplace where he didn't see it, how could he discover that the attribution was wrong? And one of the commentators says, if he perfects his performance now, if he sets himself to be absolutely perfect in his performance of Torah, and things don't change, the suffering continues, then he has good reason to think that wasn't the problem. So this is, I think, the way we usually explain this passage in the Gemara in practical terms. Since your attribution of your investigation of your actions is not going to be perfect anyway, the thing to do is pick something and improve. Okay, if you're a very great person, do everything perfectly. Okay, but if you're not, pick something and improve and say to Ribbon Shalom, listen, I can't find it, but I take it as a signal that I should be doing better. I'm doing this, and I hope that this will be counted in my favor, and that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will have mercy on me. That's the way you do it without actually identifying it. I think that's the way who, according to my understanding, is very difficult to find out what the cause was, is to get credit for the fact that you are taking your situation seriously and you are acting to improve your performance. I think this is not different from normal logic. Suppose you're producing a product which is supposed to be pure, and you find out that it's contaminated. So of course, the first thing you would do is look for a cause. Suppose you don't find a cause, and you know it's contaminated. I think what you would do is just strengthen the system, put in more checks and balances. Hire extra people or new people. Look for a new program to do the checking, and hope that will do the job. You wouldn't just say, "I didn't find it, so my hands are tied." No, you would take whatever precautions that you could possibly take in order to be able to do it better. Yeah.
I was wondering, should the punishments be, can the causes of the punishments be overdetermined? As if I received, let's say, punishment A, because I did X and because I did Y. But if I just did X, I would still receive punishment A, or if I just did Y, I would receive punishment A. I just happen to do both. Is that possible? Just to do
Well,
both?
sure. I mean, someone who murders 3 people, you can only kill them once. So if you're talking about the punishment in this world, that certainly happens all the time. The question is raised, which might now show you that in divine terms this wouldn't happen. The question is raised, in my memory, it's the Ramban, although I might be wrong. Let's suppose a person does a transgression which carries kores. Kores means being cut off from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And if it's tikares, according to some, that means not only is he cut off, his life will be shortened, but he has no share of the world to come. Okay, he did it. He knows he did it, and he knows what the punishment is. Is there any motivation for him not to do it again, or not to do other ones? What more can you do than have him die in this world and have him not live in the next world? There's nothing left to do. Would that mean that the principle of reward and punishment doesn't function so as to motivate him to behave well? So the answer that I saw is that it could function, because if you understand Gehenna as a punishment, also a cleansing process for some, but it's a punishment after death, so you could say to him, listen, when you die, you're going to be cut off, and your soul's going to disappear, and you're going to be annihilated. But before you're annihilated, you could spend time in Gehenna also. So and how much time would you like to spend? 1 month, 2 months, 3 months? Every time you do the Avera, you spend more time in Gehenna before you're annihilated. That could give him motivation not to do more crimes. So that would be the case, that it wouldn't be overdetermined. If there's an extra crime, there'll be an extra punishment.
But in this world, you're saying it shouldn't certainly be overdetermined.
Well, I mean, the divine punishment in this world also could escape being overdetermined. It's only human punishment in this world that can't escape that.
When you say escape, though, it means, I'm not talking about in certain instances where you're obviously punished for doing X and doing Y. But in general, or sometimes your punishments grouped together, which individually you would still be punished for doing X and doing Y. But the same punishment applies if you do both. Does that question make sense then?
Well, the question makes sense, but I don't think it's correct, because the Kodesh Baruch Hu's scales of justice are very exact. Mm-hmm. And the fact that you did it over and over again should make a difference in the way in which you're treated.
You're saying it has to be a different punishment, or at least a greater punishment.
That's right, greater anyway. That's right. It wouldn't have to be different in quality, but it would have to be greater, just let's say in time. And the punishment for this transgression is 2 hours of toothache. Did it 20 times, it'll be 40 hours of toothache. I think that's right. I don't think you. Yeah.
I mean, it's gonna sound hard, but if this person knows he's gonna be annihilated, and each time he performs the Avera, he will just have an extra suffering. But couldn't we interpret also that side, that he will have more time, even if it's suffering, than just annihilated entirely? Like, wouldn't also motivate him the other way around, like to be there?
Okay, so they all talk about this, euthanasia and mercy killing and the rest of that, right? And the starting point always is to say, let's ask him, would he rather die or would he rather live? There are people who commit suicide. They can't face the suffering, so they commit suicide. Even people who commit suicide, they can't face emotional suffering. People who commit suicide in 1929 with the stock market crash, we've talked about that. The idea of living life impoverished, not being provided to the family, or whatever it is, they prefer to commit suicide. So you can put a person in a situation where the pain is so intense that he'd rather be dead. Gemara has a general statement that threatening someone with death, many people have withstood the threat of death and have been willing to die rather than do the wrong thing. But torture, said Chaim Michel of Azaria, who were threatened, if they had been threatened with torture, they were threatened, it just didn't work, then they would have bowed to the tzelem. Torture can be applied in such a way that it's can overwhelm a person. Indeed, we saw when the Rambam talked about Job, and I told you the pasuk in Job says, "Eo bli das yedaber," Job speaks without das. When I read that the first time I read the book of Job, I thought, well, why doesn't he just keep quiet? What do you mean he spoke without das? If you don't understand, then don't talk. The Talmud takes it as an excuse. He can't be held responsible. There's such pain that he's not held responsible for the terrible things that he said. So it seems that pain can put you in a position where, so I think that's because Baruch Hu could arrange to make it painful enough that he would regret that he did it. Yeah.
In the case of then we were talking about with Kares, how would reward work? So like in other words, if I'm only experiencing early death and I'm going to be cut off from the world to come, then therefore why should I do good things, if that makes sense? So not, in a sense, I'm not doing bad things in order to escape Gehenna, but why should I be doing good things then?
I tell you, this is this I know from the Ramban. This is a fascinating thing. You can use this as a quiz. If a person hasn't heard it, I don't care how many black hats he wears, he'll find it challenging. Imagine a person who, on Rosh Hashanah, the decree is that he should die this year. Says the Ramban, you could have such a person who, in the course of the year, will commit a gigantic crime, and because of the gigantic crime, the decree that he should die this year will be annulled, and he will live out the year. Yeah, how does that work? How does that work?
So that he can be punished.
Stop the camera, stop the film, and stop and think about it for 5 minutes before I get my answer, the Ramban's answer. Ramban says as follows: the vast majority of people have successes and failures. The failures have to be dealt with. Do tshuva is one thing. If you don't do tshuva, there's certain ways of suffering that can take off the effects, and they go to the world to come. A tiny proportion of people don't deserve the world to come. They don't deserve the world to come. What's going to be with the mitzvahs that they have performed? They have to be rewarded. God is fair. So the answer is they're rewarded in this world. Now, this guy was slated to die this year and go to the world to come. In August, he committed a gigantic crime. Because of that gigantic crime, he tipped himself over into the 0.001% that aren't going to get the world to come. Now, all his mitzvahs have to be paid in this world, and there isn't enough time left this year to pay him off for all his mitzvahs, so he will live longer. So the motivation for doing mitzvahs is you'll have a better life before you die.
Who says this, you said?
Sorry?
Who says this?
Up to the last sentence, the Ramban says it.
Ramah?
No, Ramban, Nachmanides. He says it in the Sha'ar HaGemul. It's possible for a person to commit a gigantic crime and thereby reverse the decree. And by the way, that means decrees are reversible. That's very important to know. And statements, voices from heaven that make proclamations are reversible. These things are not absolute. They think they're absolute. It creates contradictions which are spurious. Right? So that's one way to motivate his doing it, because if he's not going to get the world to come, then he's got to get the reward for all of his mitzvahs in this world. And that will make his life in this world, much better. Much more pleasant anyway. Yeah? Okay, so we'll pick up here tomorrow.